Hi everyone, this is the Seagulls tutorial. This is the reference photo that I used for this painting. It was taken by Nikki Pay and I downloaded it from Pixabay. I chose to paint on a piece of Fabriano Artistico soft press watercolour paper. The tooth of soft press paper sits in between cold press and hot press paper. It's got a slight texture, but it's not as textured as cold press paper. It allows you to easily use pencils over your watercolour painting if you wanted to enhance it. I've only just started using it and I'm very impressed with it. But you don't need to use soft press paper for this painting. Use whatever paper you're used to using. My paper size is 51 centimetres by 31 centimetres. I took a full sheet, I cut it into half, and then I cut it again so that it would fit onto my gator board, and that's the size that I ended up with. I've stretched it and attached it to my gator board, and I've got it in landscape orientation. You'll notice that there are some broken lines around the edges of my seagulls. Those are the areas where I plan to leave lost edges. I'll show you what I do there when I work my way through the painting. I'm going to use some French ultramarine, some burnt sienna, some transparent orange. You could use any orange there or mix some red with some yellow. And right at the end here, I've got some sepia. I'll also be using a small amount of lamp black on the eyes. I want to paint the background in first. So I'm going to use French ultramarine, but I'll mix some burnt sienna into it to tone it down a bit. So I've got some fresh French ultramarine there that I've just squirted out on my palette, and some fresh burnt sienna. That'll give me a grey, and if I add more blue, it'll be more of a blue-grey colour. I'm using a fair amount of pigment because I want the colour to be fairly dark. I don't want to have to paint back over it with a second layer. I'll mix a bit more French ultramarine into it because I want more of a blue than I do a grey. I've got my little 5080 flat Da Vinci brush. This is 4 centimetres in width. I'm going to wet the background with some clean water. I try to paint the water on carefully because I don't want any of the paint to go onto the seagull. I'm only going to work on the right-hand side of the painting at this stage. I've wet out to the edge of the paper, out where the blue tape is. I've got my number 7 brush and I pick up that blue-grey mixture and I mix some water with it so that it flows. I'll start right here at the head. This is where I want the deepest colour to be. The background is forming the shape of the bird's head, so I need to paint it in carefully. Run it carefully around the beak as well, underneath the neck, down to where my pencil line stops. Just here, there's a pencil line, and I won't take it much further than that. My water extends down further than that pencil line though. I don't want the paint to drift to the edge of the water because it will give me a hard line where I don't want it. And then I carefully paint in the back of the neck and over the top of the head. Once I've done that, I lift the board off the table. I add a bit more paint, and then I'm hoping that it will flow towards the edge of the paper. I give it a little push if it's not moving enough, and then some more paint. Dip into the water if you need to. I'm determined not to fuss with this. Once I get the paint on there, I'm just going to leave it and accept what I get. I've just picked up a bit more water on my brush, tilting the paper up to that top right corner. I dipped my brush in the water again. And now I'll get rid of that line there. Because the water and paint is accumulating along the edge, I take a paper towel to take off the excess. If I leave it there, when the paint and paper start to dry, that will create watercolour blooms because it'll flow back onto it as it's drying. I left it flat on the table to dry for a while, and then I used my hairdryer to dry it off completely. Now I'll work on the left-hand side of the background. There's a lost edge here, and there's another one down here. So my plan is to put the background colour through this section here, because that will form the edge of the bird there. And on the back here, there's no colour on the bird. So if I put a bit of background colour on the back, that will create the edge there. But I'll try and keep the paint away from those lost edges. And those lost edges help to create depth. So here I'm wetting the paper right up to the edge of the bird and right over to the edge of the paper as well. Get some clean water if you need to. And take it right to the edge of the paper. Use a fair amount of water as well. Now I use the same colour, but I mix a bit more water with it because I don't want it quite as dark on this other side. This bird is behind the one in front, so the colour on the background can be a bit lighter here. I don't need to draw attention to this bird so much as the one in front. I put the paint along the edge where my pencil line was, and then I lift the painting off the table and I hold it up towards the top right corner to make the paint drift that way. You can see I've left it away from my lost edge there as well. Just a bit more paint because I don't want it to be too pale. I want to be able to see it. And over here on the front, where my pencil lines are, I paint the grey carefully around the bird. And then a bit more paint and I hold it up towards the top left edge this time. Just let it drift. If it's not moving enough, I add a bit more paint. Try to keep the paint away from the edge of the water because I don't want any hard paint lines forming if I can help it. Bit more paint up here. And then I take off the excess again with my paper towel. Just tidy up this lost area here. So I'm going to let that sit and dry of its own accord. And this is what it looked like after it had dried. I've taken a photo of my painting at this stage and I've included it for you to download. This is progress photo 1. I want to paint in the eye on the bird on the left. So I've got my little zero brush and some sepia. I'll paint on dry paper, just the eyeball itself. I'll paint over the top of the pupil that's there. I also leave a little highlight at the front of the eye. So I've left a little white circle there. Okay, while I wait for that to dry, I'll get some colour onto the beak. For that, I'll use some transparent orange. I'll mix a bit of water with it so that it's not too bright. You could use red and yellow mixed together here. It doesn't have to be a pre-mixed orange. I've got my number 3 brush here and I paint that watery orange onto the dry paper. I'll switch to my little 0 brush for that last little fine bit in the corner. When you wash your beak in, make sure that the orange you use is slightly watered down so that it's not at its full strength. While I've got the orange there, I'll paint in the beak on the other bird. And again here, the orange is slightly watered down. And then I thought I might as well paint in the legs while I'm at it. For the legs, I've used a bit more pigment and I've mixed a bit of burnt sienna into it as well. I'll paint on the dry paper here as well using my number 3 brush. And then I painted in these other 2 as well on the dry paper. I'll go back to the eye now, and I'm using some lamp black. I've got my 0 brush, it's wet. The black has gone dry, so I'm wiping my brush over the pigment. I'm going to paint in the pupil. This I do on the dry paper. I try and paint around the little highlight that I've left as well. You might find it easier to draw this in with a black ink pen. If you do, use an archival ink pen that's waterproof. Now I'm going to take that paint out onto the outside of the eye to paint in those darker areas that I can see. I hold the brush right up on the point. I'm holding it perpendicular to the paper. I run it around the outside edge of the eye. I'm looking closely at the reference photo as I do this. And the paper is dry. Now I'm looking at that area in front of the eye. I can see some darker marks there. So I'm still using black on the dry paper here. I'm painting slowly and carefully. Now I'm going to dip my brush in my water container and dab it on my towel, and then I'll use it to spread some of the paint out. Drag it underneath the eye a bit. Just creating those grey marks that I can see on the seagull. There's some darker feathers just here where my brush is. So I'm wetting that area with water, just in front of my pencil line there. And here I've got the black paint again. I dab it in front of the pencil line and it bleeds and gives me those soft paint edges. Up here though, the paper's dry. Just here beside the beak I can see a little grey line. So I've wet that area with water, which will keep my paint edges soft there. I don't really want a hard line there. I'll use some black again. Just paint it on the wet paper. There's only a tiny amount of paint on my brush. There's a small grey section above the beak just there, so I've wet that with water. And here I've got a little bit of the black paint. On the other side of the beak, you can just see, I think they're little eyelashes from the eye. So I've wet that little triangular section there with water, and I've got a tiny bit of black on my brush here. And I'm going to take it off onto the background where it's dry as well. Just paint some little eyelashes in there. I think that's all I need to do there. On the head, there's some grey feathers running from the back of the eye up over the top of the head. So I'm going to paint those on wet paper. I'll keep the paint really pale because it's quite pale on the reference photo. I'll use the grey that I mixed for the background, which was burnt sienna and French ultramarine. Just giving it a mix again. And I'll paint that onto the wet paper here. That will keep the paint edges soft. And the colour is quite pale. Just loose little marks that bleed over the wet paper is what I'm looking for. And looking really carefully at the reference photo, I can see a little grey shadow on the side of the head there. So I've just painted some water on there. And here I've got the grey mixture again. And that's a bit there above the beak. I have to look really close at the reference photo to see the differences in the white feathers. Just here I can see a line slightly darker than the white feathers above. So I've just wet under my pencil line and I've got the grey here. Just dabbing that onto the wet paper. And here I'll wet the area above my pencil line closer to the beak because I can see a grey shadow area there as well. And again, I've got the grey paint, but I've switched down to my little 0 brush. And I've just picked up a small amount of sepia. It's very watery, the colour's quite pale. Just here on the side of the bird, I can see a very pale grey there. So I've wet that with water. And here I've got the grey mixture again. I take the paint out of my brush and I use it to spread the paint out a little bit more. Then I looked at this area here behind the beak and I could see that that grey area tends to point downwards slightly and I've got it straight across. So I've put a bit more of the grey colour there as well. A little bit more grey here in front of the eye on the dry paper, and I'll take a photo of my painting now for you. Here's a photo of my painting at this stage. This one is Progress Photo 2 that you can download. Down here on the reference photo, I can see some grey feathers. I'm going to wet that area. I'll wet a larger area than where the paint will go to make sure that the paint doesn't drift to the edge of the water, giving me a hard line where I don't want it. If you find your water is looking a bit dirty, clean it out so that you've got some clean water there. And again here I use the grey that I mixed for the background. If it varies slightly in colour, it's because I've picked it up in the puddle where there might have been a bit more burnt sienna. The paint starts to separate on the palette. I'm not concerned about that when that happens. I think that adds interest to your painting when your colours vary slightly. Just picked up a bit more paint there. I'll fix up that corner. Push the paint up a little. And just here I'll put a bit more. And I've kept my lost edge there. So I've kept the paint away from that open edge. Okay, now I want to get some paint on this wing area. I'll work on wet paper again because along the top of the wing I want the paint edge to be soft. I want it to fade away into the white feathers. So I extend the water again past the area where the paint will sit. I use my number 7 brush to put the water on there. It gets it on there nice and quick for me. This is the edge along here that I want to be soft. Here you can see how my paint mixture has separated. So depending on where I pick it up, I might get a slightly different colour. That goes straight onto the wet paper. I'll paint all those feathers in at once with the one colour, and then I'll paint the detail over the top of that later. Up the top here, where these grey feathers hit the white feathers, I can have a hard edge there. And along the front as well, there can be a hard edge. There's a hard edge there, but here at the back, I want the paint to blend off gently into the white feathers. Okay, I'll dry that wing off now with my hairdryer. I'll leave the wing for a moment, and I'm going to get some detail on this beak. I paint the top beak first with some water. I use my little zero brush to pick up some of the lamp black. And right on the tip of the beak, it's darker, so I paint the black there. I've got enough black there now, so I dip my brush in my water container, dry it on my cloth, and then I use the paint that's on the paper. I spread it out, push it where I want it. I'll drag it along the edge of the top and bottom beak. Up here there's a little dark section, so I'll paint that on. Still using black. I might darken that edge with a bit more paint. For the nostril there, I decided to use sepia rather than black. I thought that the black might be a bit too dark. The paper's only slightly damp. It's starting to dry now. Then I use my hairdryer on it to dry it off so that I can paint the bottom beak in. I've got my pencil here. There's a little square spot on the bottom of the beak and then it curves up a bit. I wet it with water. This is my number 3 brush. And then I use the zero brush and the black paint again. I paint very carefully because I want to get the shape of the beak right. And again, I feel I've got enough paint on the paper, so I just wiped my brush on my cloth and then I can push it up further. A little bit more water here on this bottom section where I've got the orange. And then right down the bottom there, you can see me getting some more of the orange. I'm going to run that along the bottom edge of the beak where it's a bit darker. Now you can see why I washed the beak in originally with watered down orange. It wasn't at its full strength. I knew that I'd need to come back and darken it in a few places. Now I'll run some water along this top beak. And I've got the orange again now. It's got more pigment in the mixture so that it's darker. I'll take the paint out of my brush now and I'll spread that out a bit with my damp brush. Okay, I'll move on to the wing feathers now. This feather down the bottom here has got some brown around the bottom edge of it. So I'm going to wet it with water and then I'll put the brown paint on there. That will give me a soft edge where the brown meets the grey. For that, I thought I'd use a mixture of burnt sienna and sepia. This is my number 3 brush, and I paint that onto the wet paper, down lower where I can see the brown on the feather. And I'll run some colour down the middle as well. I'll take the paint out of my brush now and I'll push that paint up a bit further. When I take the paint out of my brush, I put it in my water container and then I dab it on my cloth. I'll draw in some of these lines that I've lost. Now I'll wet this one here with water. I've got my 0 brush this time and a mixture of the 2 browns. This one here I'll paint on the dry paper. That's with the same brown mixture, but it's got a bit more water mixed into it. I'll paint in that little one as well. My drawing differs a bit from the reference photo. I had to try and simplify it as much as I could. I'll drag this paint right down to that remaining feather that's there. This lighter colour will remain showing around the edge of the feather. I'll be coming over the top with the darker brown later. Those little brown feathers that I just painted in are now dry, and I need to paint a darker area on them. For that, I'll use sepia on its own. So that's much darker than that lighter mixture that I painted on them first. I'm using my 0 brush so that I've got a bit more control and I don't flood the paper with paint. So I want to try and leave the lighter colour showing around the edge. There I'm flicking it up into the white to create some little separations on the feathers. I'll skip a feather and I'll paint this one. That's some water. You could paint these on dry paper if you don't mind having hard edges around the outside edge of the feather. So where the dark brown meets the light brown, you'd have a hard edge rather than a soft edge. So if you don't want to fuss like this, just paint them on the dry paper and leave a little gap of the lighter brown showing around the edge. I wet this one with water as well. I've got sepia again here. I paint it up around the edge of the other feathers and then I pull it down. But as I said, I leave a little light edge around the outside of it. And then I do the same thing here. I put a bit of water on this one. You didn't see me, but I did put some water on there. On this big feather at the bottom, I thought I'd put a bit more grey to bring out the edge of the feathers above. So I've just wet that with water, and here I've got the grey mixture. That's French ultramarine mixed with burnt sienna. And now I'll spread the paint out with my damp brush. Soften away those edges. So that darker colour has brought out the bottom edges of the feathers above. I've taken a photo of my painting at this stage and I've included it for you to download. This one is progress photo 3. Using that brown mixture of the 2 browns, sepia and burnt sienna, slightly watered down so it's not too dark, I'm painting in this group of feathers here on the dry paper. There's another one just here I can get some colour on. Same colour, just on the dry paper. This one as well. And I'll drag it down onto the one below too. There's a few little flicks off into the grey feathers. This is water here on my brush. That was my number 3 brush. Now I'm using my 0 brush and the grey. Darkening the tops of some of those feathers. And down in this space here, I've got some of the grey and I'm painting that on the dry paper. I'm not really looking at the reference photo at the moment. I've done my own thing there because it's a bit confusing. Here's some grey as well on the dry paper. I take the paint out of my brush and I use it damp to soften away that edge. A little bit of grey here on the dry paper underneath that feather above. I take the paint out of my brush again. I soften away the edges. Flick it up into that one above. Now I dry all of that with my hairdryer so I can continue on. A bit more colour here, that's the grey on the dry paper. Take the paint out of my brush, soften away that edge. This is sepia now. This time I'm going to paint it on the dry paper and leave a hard edge around the outside edge of each feather. I can't be bothered fussing with these. They're so small it doesn't matter. So it's sepia on the dry paper, leaving a little light edge at the bottom of each of them. Later on, I come back and I change the shape of the left-hand edge of these feathers. So don't be concerned at the moment if it doesn't look quite like my finished painting. I think I've created another one there. Then I looked at it and I thought there's too many here, so I thought I'd paint one in and make it a bit bigger than the others. They looked a bit too uniform for me. And here I've got a bit more of the grey. It's darker this time. Take the paint out of my brush again and soften away the paintage. Okay, now I want to bring out a few of these feather shapes on the wing. So I've got the grey mixture here. I've just painted that on dry paper and then I soften away that edge. So the colour needs to be quite pale. I don't want these feathers to be too dark. I paint it underneath my pencil line. And then I take the paint out of my brush and use it damp to soften away the paintage. And that's given me a little bottom edge of a feather there. I'm layering a bit of grey here on this feather as well. That's on dry paper too. Some grey here, dry paper. And here, this is the space in between two feathers. Some colour under this one. Take the paint out of my brush, use it damp to soften away the paintage at the bottom. Take the paint out of my brush again, soften away that edge. Right here I'll create another feather, just the edge of it. And now I'll soften away that hard edge there. And then I created another little one just up there. It's very faint and I'm just suggesting the shape of a feather. Looking at this one after it had dried, I realised I had to do it again. After I did those, I noticed that I had a straight edge running down the side of these feathers that I didn't really like the look of. I thought it looked a bit too uniform and straight. So I've just widened that feather there. I've got sepia and I painted that on the dry paper to try and make it a bit thicker there. I might do something on this one as well. A little bit more colour on that one and that one. So now instead of that edge being straight, it's got a bit of a wave in it, which I think looks a bit more natural. So then, because I darkened those feathers on the right-hand side, I decided to put a bit more colour on these feathers on the left-hand side. So this is sepia on dry paper. All I'm doing is layering it over the top of the previous layer. Now I've got two hard edges on those feathers. And then I decided to add some little veins down the centre with sepia on the dry paper. It's my zero brush. And I'll take a photo of my painting at this stage for you now too. So here is progress photo 4 that you can download. Now I want to work on this other eye. I've got my pencil here and I'm just adjusting things just to make sure I put the paint in the right place. I'll give myself a little highlight up the top. These lines are drawn onto the line drawing for you already. I'll start with the eye. For that I'll use some watered down lamp black. This is my zero brush. The paper's dry. Just a light covering of black all over. And now I'll drag it out in front of the eye to paint in that shape that I can see there. And then I'll take it around the eye over the top of my pencil line that I've got there. And along the bottom. And there's a little V shape at the back as well. Now I'm painting some water on that section under the beak. I use my zero brush to pick up some of the grey paint. This is the original grey that I mixed right at the start of the painting. I'll paint that under there. And just here I can see a little grey line. I'll run it along the bottom edge. And then I'll pull some of that colour together. Now I wet above that pencil line there that's on the top of the beak. And I use the grey there. I'll pull a few lines upward to create some little feather shapes. And just in there, a few more on the dry paper this time. It's still too wet under there. A few little grey marks here and there on the dry paper now. Using the reference photo as my guide. It's only a tiny bit of paint on my brush, it's just residue grey that's on there. To help you get to this stage, this is a photo of my painting. This one is progress photo 5 that you can download. Before, when I painted the eye, I used watery black. Now I want darker black, so I wipe my brush over the pigment that's hardened on the palette. I'll paint around the little highlight that you can see on the eye. The paper's dry here. And then I start to drag it out onto that shape that I painted earlier. I've taken the paint out of my brush now, it's just damp with water, and I'm pulling some of that paint out into the area in front of the eye. I've only got residue paint on my brush. And here I've still only got a little bit of the residue paint, but you could use some grey there. Got my number 3 brush and I'm painting some water in front of that mark behind the eye. I've got some black on my 0 brush. I dab that in front of my pencil line. Let the paint bleed gently. I've only got a tiny bit of paint on my brush. And I just wiped my brush over the black where it's dried on the palette so that I can get some darker pigment. I paint that on there to cover the pencil line. Some of these fine lines here above the beak could be a bit darker as well, so I've got some black here too. The paper's dry there. Black here. And now some water on the head. I'm going to paint some loose grey feathers up there as well. Again, using the reference photo as a guide. This is grey, but I don't have a lot of paint on my brush. Just paint it onto the wet paper and let it bleed. Here I've got my small eradicator brush, just tidying up the front edge of the seagull. The paper is dry and the brush is wet. Just got a bit of background paint on there. And now I'll paint in the beak. This is water on the top beak. I switch to my little 0 brush. Black, I'll wipe the brush over the pigment. And then I paint that onto the tip or the end of the beak. Just working on the top beak at this stage. I'll also run some colour along the edge between the top and bottom beak. I've picked up a touch more of the pigment there just to darken the tip. A little bit of black here. And then I decided to use the black on the nostril as well. I know I used sepia on the other one, but I decided to go with black on here. I'll leave the beak to dry for now and I'll get some colour on this wing. I've used my pencil to draw in a few jagged edges along here just to remind myself to create a jagged edge there. I've also drawn in a line where I'll be wetting. So down there, along there, and up here. That's the area that I'll be painting in now. I'm going to wet the paper. I need a soft edge along the top here, so I'm going to take the water right up to the back of the neck. I need to mix some more grey. I use French ultramarine and burnt sienna. This is the French ultramarine. And I mix the two until I get a colour I like. If I want a warmer grey, I'll use more burnt sienna. If I want a cooler grey, I'll mix more of the blue into it. And for this, I'll mix more of the blue into it, I think. I'll paint on wet paper again. This is my number 7 brush. And here's where I stopped the water, where I've created those darker lines. And I want my grey mixture, but fairly pale. I smooth the water out to make sure there's no puddles lying anywhere. And then I use the grey to paint onto the wet paper. I've taken that up too high there, so I'm just going to pull it back a bit. Clean brush. Then I start to run it down the front edge. I might soften that edge just there. And then I keep going. And don't be concerned if your paint starts to separate on the wings, if you start to see a bit more blue or a bit more of the burnt sienna. Just go with it. Okay, I'm going to get a smaller brush now, a little 0, and I'll pull some of that grey onto the white feathers to create those little jagged edges that you see. I've got some paper towel here. I've just twisted it to make a little point. I'm going to dab where the white feathers are on the wings, the feathers with the little bits of brown on them. I end up, I think, with an extra row of feathers here somehow. I don't know whether I've drawn it incorrectly or what I've done, but somewhere along the line I end up with another row of feathers. But I go with it. I don't let it bother me. I remember getting a bit confused here when I was trying to work out where to take the paint off. And that brings me to Progress Photo 6 that I've included for you to download. Okay, now I'll get some colour on these lower feathers. Again, I work on the wet paper. That will keep the paint edges soft and make everything look fluffy and soft and round. Using the same brush, number 7, I paint the grey paint on there. That's the mix of burnt sienna and French ultramarine. It's the same colour I used on the wings. Now I have to keep an eye on the reference photo to make sure I don't put it where I don't want it. Paint it carefully around the little legs. And then I've got my lost edge there. I've just picked up some more grey paint where it's a bit bluer so that I could drop that in there to change the colour slightly. And with my little 0 brush I can paint a few little random flicks off the edge. Tidy things up. And now I'm going to paint a bit more colour here where my pencil line is. So that's some water. I've got another lost edge up the top there. And here I've got the grey again. Just dab it onto the wet paper. Just randomly. I can't really see much colour there on the bird, but I thought I wanted to put a bit of colour. Then I let it start to dry. And before it dries completely, I drop a little bit of water in to disturb that grey paint and it creates a watercolour bloom. Now I'm going to start getting some detail on these wing feathers. The paper's completely dry. I've got my 0 brush and some more of the grey paint. I'm starting to look at the reference photo and paint those shapes in that I can see that the feathers are forming. carefully at the reference photo. I'm painting freehand here, I don't have any lines to guide. Just here, I'm running it over my pencil line. And here I've switched to my number 2 brush, and I'm going to start to darken some of these areas where they touch the other feathers. That's on dry paper. Now I take the paint out of my brush and I soften the paint edge. And when I take the paint out of the brush, I've said this before, I quickly dab it in my water pot and then I dry it on my brush. I just give it a quick dab on the brush to take the excess moisture off. Again, I'm on dry paper there with the grey, and I soften away that edge. When you go to soften the edge, be careful you don't have too much water on your brush. I'm painting in the area where the feather above touches the feather below. That creates a little soft shadow and helps to define the feathers. Here I've got my 0 brush. I'm going to pull some of that onto the feather above to create some separations. When I painted this, I made sure the colour that I was using wasn't too dark. I just wanted it to tone in with everything else. Some more grey there. And there as well. A bit more grey there too. Use Progress Photo 7 to help you paint all these feathers in. You can see what I'm doing. I'm painting on the dry paper and then I'm softening the paint edges. As I paint this, I'm not really looking at the reference photo because I don't see a lot going on with the reference photo. I'm just trying to bring some of the edges of my feathers out. This is my number 2 brush. I've been alternating between my number 2 and my number 3. You don't need both, just use one or the other. I've got them both out beside me and I just grab one without realising what it is. When I soften the paint edge, I always give my brush a quick dab on the cloth to get the excess moisture off it. Over here, I'm wetting this area where those little white feathers are on the wing. I've got my 0 brush and some burnt sienna here. Just paint it onto the wet paper and it bleeds. That one was a bit dry, so I've just spread it out with my damp brush. Just here, the paper's dry. The paper's dry there as well. Here is Progress Photo 7 that you can download. Use this one to help you paint all those details on the wing. Okay, now I'm starting to paint some more colour on these feathers here. Remember I said I had an extra layer somehow. I don't know what I did wrong there, but something went wrong in the drawing process. So here I'm layering another layer of the grey over the top on the dry paper. I haven't taken that grey all the way to the bottom of the feather though. I'm going to get some burnt sienna, but I'll mix some sepia with it, just so it's not too red looking. And I'll paint that just at the bottom. The grey's still wet, so it's blending with the grey. I'll skip a few feathers so I don't disturb that one. I paint the grey on the top half. I don't take it all the way down. while that's wet, I drop in some of the brown at the bottom of it. Grey up the top. I quickly wash the grey out of my brush and I pick up some of the brown mixture. And I paint that on there before it dries. And I leave the bottom of the feather with no paint on it. And now I've come back and done all the feathers that I missed. And here I've got the brown mixture, and I paint a little vein down the centre of some of them. The feathers below, I'm putting a bit of colour at the top there, basically so that I can form the bottom of the feather above. So I'm using the grey on dry paper. It's not too dark, it's still quite pale. So I've just formed the edge of the feather above, and then I take the paint out of my brush and soften away that paint edge there. I'll skip a feather so I don't disturb the one I just painted. I get in the edge of the one above, take the paint out of my brush, soften away that paint edge. And I'll do that all the way along. Here's where I was getting confused with my feathers, and I drew in an extra little feather here. And I drew in one here again, but then I end up removing them. So that one I just drew, I remove now, and the little one that you saw me draw first, I don't paint over later, I just turn that into one feather. So ignore what I've just done then with the pencil. Here I've got the grey mixture again. This time when I paint it on, I'm going to leave a little edge at the front with no paint on it. So you can see I've left a little lighter edge just there. That's to define one feather from the other. If you look on the reference photo, they've got lighter edges. So with this next one, I take the paint right up against that previous feather, but not all the way over to the edge on the right-hand side. And that leaves me with that lighter edge there. So every second feather will have a lighter edge. Again here, I take it up against the previous feather on the left-hand side, but I leave a little gap on the right-hand side. And then I soften the edge at the bottom. This is my little number 2 brush that I'm using. Now I'll do this one right at the back. And I leave that lighter edge on the right-hand side of it. This is my extra layer of feathers here. As I said, I don't know what I did there, but somehow I got an extra layer in. So I'll treat these ones the same as those feathers that I painted down lower. I'm using the grey mixture. I painted on the dry paper, and I leave the bottom edge lighter in colour. I skip a feather and paint the next one, leaving the lighter part with no paint on it. And I'll soften that paint edge now. That one I didn't leave a lighter edge on. Then I'll come back and paint the others. I'll try and leave a lighter edge along the front of it. Okay, that's those painted in. There's a little one here at the back I'll paint on. I dried that off, and now I'm removing any pencil lines that aren't covered with paint. I took a photo of my painting at this stage. This one is Progress Photo 8 that you can download. Just here on the wing, there's a grey feather that I'm going to paint in. I'll paint it in now before I lose track of where it is. So I'm wetting it with water. I've mixed some more grey for myself from French ultramarine and burnt sienna. I wet this one because I'm not going to take the grey paint all the way to the edge of the feather, and where the grey stops, I want a soft edge. I've also got to put some brown on this feather, so that gives me a bit more time to get the brown on there as well. For the brown, I'll mix some sepia into burnt sienna. That's sepia, and I've got burnt sienna just there. And before the grey dries, I paint that on there. Flick it into the feather beside that to create some separations, and that one as well. Moving on up to this one, I'll do a similar thing here. I wet the feather with water. I don't want to take the paint all the way to the edge of the feather. With my little zero brush here, I've got burnt sienna. There's no sepia mixed with it, it's just burnt sienna. And I'll keep the burnt sienna away from the outer edge. Flick it up into the other feather to create the separations. And here I've got a bit of the burnt sienna sepia mixture. I'll drop that on there while it's wet. So that gives me the two colours showing there. I've just wet this feather here with water, and I've got some burnt sienna now. I'll get some of the mixture of the two colours, and I'll paint that on there before it dries. I'm looking at the reference photo as I pause. Some water on this one with my number 2 brush. And here I've got burnt sienna, just on its own, there's no sepia mixed with it. I'll leave some white showing at the bottom of the feather. Before that dries, I drop in some of the mixture of the two colours. Some water on this feather on the outside. And here on my zero brush, I've got the mixture of the two browns. Okay, I'll stop there and I'll take a photo of my painting again now for you. This one is Progress Photo 9 that you can download. Some water here on this feather. And this is the mixture of the two browns, burnt sienna and sepia. Now I wet this one with water. Now I'm just using burnt sienna on its own. I didn't take it all the way down to the bottom edge of the feather. This is a mixture of the two colours now. And I've just picked up some sepia on its own. Pull that colour up into the feather above. I wet this feather with water as well, and I've got some burnt sienna here. Again, I keep the paint away from the outer edge of the feather. And before the burnt sienna dries, I drop some sepia on there. I've just wiped my brush over the pigment. So this is sepia, but it's really dark. So the sepia has gone hard in the palette, and I wipe my wet brush over the top of it. I wet this one with water as well. I won't show you the wetting of the paper all the time because it's too monotonous and takes too long. I've got burnt sienna here. I put the water on with either my number 2 or number 3 brush, and then the paint on with the 0 brush. That gives me a bit more control, and it stops me from flooding the paper with paint. Before the burnt sienna dries, I paint a bit of sepia along there. And some little feather separations on the surrounding feathers. This one was wet with water also. I've got burnt sienna there. Again, I don't take it all the way out to the edge of the feather. Then, before it dries, I paint some sepia on and some more feather separations. This feather is also wet. Some burnt sienna there. And sepia. The burnt sienna is still wet. I wet this one as well. Burnt sienna here. Painted around the edge of the other one, leaving a little bit of white paper showing, and I don't take the burnt sienna all the way to the edge again. And then some sepia, or you could use the brown mixture, it doesn't matter. There's another wing feather to paint there, but all the feathers around it are wet, so I'll leave it to dry for a moment, and I'll come up here to the beak. I just wet that bottom beak with water, and now I've got some lamp black on my brush. I'll paint in that dark shape on the bottom beak now. This is my 0 brush. It's still slightly damp, so I've got a bit of the transparent orange on my brush now. Again, I wiped my brush over the pigment so that it's quite dark. Soften away that edge a bit more there. And I'll put a little bit of the transparent orange there on the nostril area. And here I've got the burnt sienna sepia brown mixture that I'm running along the edge of the top beak where it touches the bottom beak. Paint a bit of water on there if it helps keep the paint edge soft. I wet this last remaining brown feather with some water, and here I've got burnt sienna again. The burnt sienna is still wet, and that's some sepia, quite dark, so I've wiped my brush over the dry pigment. I'll redraw these little feathers back in for myself. I seem to have lost them. These are quite straightforward. I thought I'd keep them simple and paint on the dry paper with some sepia. I'll leave a small white border around the edge. I can paint them in fairly quickly. Just use a small brush. This is a number 2. And I went all the way to the front like that, just leaving a little white edge around each one. Here I'm adding the white areas on these brown feathers. You'll have these on the line drawing, I just haven't drawn them onto mine yet. There's a lighter section there on that brown feather as well. And I'm just going to make this feather here a bit wider. Run it underneath that other one. I'll start with this one here. This is sepia on dry paper. Quite straightforward. I take the paint right to the edge of the feather. And I paint around that white section. I'll paint this one in here as well. Sepia on dry paper. And I take it underneath that other one. I've taken a photo of my painting at this stage. This one is Progress Photo 10 that you can download. Still going with the tail feathers. I'm using sepia. I keep going on the dry paper with the sepia until they're all painted in. And then there's a little one right on the tip. Rather than try and paint it in without getting it on the other feather, I've just taken it over the top there. And there's another one just here that I missed. I'll let that dry, so I'll come over here to this other tail and paint this bottom section in here first with some water. This is the grey mixture, the French ultramarine mixed with burnt sienna. I'll paint it on around the edges and I'll leave the white showing in the middle. Just fix up this edge along here, make it a bit straighter. Then I used some sepia and I painted all those brown feathers in at once on the dry paper. Going back to those feathers on the left-hand side, I'm getting some sepia, darker this time, so there's less water in it. I've got my number 3 brush. I'll start to darken these feathers, and I'm on the dry paper here. I'll leave a little gap of the lighter colour showing. I keep going with that darker pigment, leaving a little gap between the feathers. Now some sepia on this one. With this one, I'll leave the lighter colour showing all the way around the outside edge of it. So I carefully paint that darker colour on. This one out here on the end could be a bit darker, so I've got some more colour there, sepia on dry paper. I'm layering over the top again. With this one, I thought I'd paint the bottom half of it. Still on the dry paper here, using sepia. And this one here could be darker, so again, I use the sepia on the dry paper. I keep the paint away from that outer edge. I keep a very fine line of the lighter colour showing on the outer edge. Then I could see that this one could probably go a bit darker as well. And I might take the brown up under there. I can see it there on the reference photo. Then I decided to paint it over the entire feather. Everything dried. This top half of this feather could be darker, but I don't want the colour to go all the way up to the top. So I've wet it with water. Now I have sepia on my zero brush. I run it up the middle and let it bleed back. And that gives me a lighter edge on the top of it. And I thought I'd darken this feather right on the end with another layer of sepia as well on the dry paper. And then I came back and redefined that edge up the middle. And here I've got a bit of sepia on my zero brush. I'm running that through that lighter section to create an extra feather there. This feather here could have a layer of sepia on it, not too dark. I will be darkening the feathers, but I want a lighter layer over the top first. Now I've got sepia a bit darker on this top one. The paper's dry. I'm doing the same thing that I did over the other side. Just layering over the top. Some more sepia over the top of this little feather here on the dry paper. This one here has got a lighter section on it, so I won't cover it completely with this darker sepia. I'm on dry paper there, looking at the reference photo as I paint. I take the paint out of my brush and I soften away that edge there. And then I deepen the colour at the back of the feather on the dry paper still. It's also darker along the front. Okay, I'm going to dry that off with the hairdryer now. I dried everything so that I wouldn't disturb the feathers I've just painted. And now I'm going to darken this one here with more sepia. Still working on dry paper. Darken the bottom half of that feather. And I'll darken the bottom half of this feather on top of it. Once I've done this one, I'll leave them to dry and I'll come back to those top sections of those feathers. Then I came back to these little feathers here and gave them another layer of sepia. I felt that they weren't dark enough in comparison to the other brown feathers. So that's on dry paper as well. Just another layer of sepia. Then I painted a line down the middle of some of these feathers just on the dry paper using sepia. Trying to keep it fairly fine. Use my zero brush. Some water on this lighter section here. And sepia a bit darker. So I've wiped my brush over the pigment that has dried on the palette. came back over here and painted the top half of those feathers that I didn't paint before. That's with the sepia on the dry paper. This one as well. By painting them separately like that, I was able to give them a centre vein so that it looked like there was a centre vein on there. Okay, this is my little number 3 brush. I'm drying it out on the towel and I'm going to pick up some of the sepia. I want to dry brush the ground underneath the feet of the seagulls. So there's a bit of moisture in my brush, not a lot, and I've picked up the paint and now I'm holding it on its side and I'm rubbing the side of the brush onto the dry paper. If you find it doesn't come off your brush, you might need a bit more moisture in it. It's called dry brushing, but you do need a bit of moisture in your brush. You don't want it to be completely dry. You want the paint to skip across the surface of the paper, leaving a mark. You don't want to have to fight with it. If you're fighting with it, your brush isn't wet enough. So keep reloading. And if you need to wet your brush again, wet it, but dry it on the towel and get most of the moisture out, but not all. If you get a little wet spot, you can use your finger to smear it out a bit. I come back to the ground later, but now I want to get some detail onto the legs. So here I'm wetting the back half of this leg on the right. Okay, I'll get some burnt sienna. I want some water mixed into it so that it flows, but I still want it to be quite dark. I'll start by painting that down the pencil line in the middle of the leg. Bleeds back towards the other side. Down the bottom here, it's a bit darker there on the reference photo. As I'm painting, I'm looking at the reference photo. Taking the paint out of my brush, I'll soften that edge there. I'll get some of the sepia burnt sienna mixture. I'll paint that on here at the back where it's not quite as red looking, orange looking. Down the bottom here where it's quite dark on the reference photo, I've got sepia on its own. I'll paint in that little claw as well. This is my zero brush that I've been using. Okay, I'll take a photo of my painting at this stage for you. This is the final progress photo that I took. This one is progress photo 11 that you can download. I'll leave that leg to dry before I paint in the front of it. This is some burnt sienna. It's my number 2 brush. I'm painting in that dark shape that I can see there on the reference photo on dry paper. While the burnt sienna is wet, I get some sepia on my zero brush and paint that in there to darken that section. Now I use my number 2 brush to wet the back half of the leg up to that pencil line that's there. This is burnt sienna with my zero brush. Some water down here on this back toe and a bit more burnt sienna there as well. Everything's still wet, so I'm painting some sepia onto the darkest areas. And I paint in that little claw that's there. And now I come back to this first leg. I paint some water on the front half of it. This is burnt sienna here. I will leave quite a bit of the lighter underwash showing. Down here the paper is dry and I'm using burnt sienna to paint on those little lines that I can see. I wet this toe here at the back with water and I've got a bit of burnt sienna there. And then a sepia claw. On the back leg here, I've got some of the burnt sienna on dry paper. You could also use the brown mixture here, the mixture of the two, burnt sienna and sepia if you want. I wet the front of the leg here and this is burnt sienna. Down the bottom of this back foot, I've got some burnt sienna on dry paper there. Some water on this front toe. And burnt sienna again. I run it along the bottom where it's a bit darker. It bleeds back up. It allows me to leave some of that lighter underwash showing. Paint a few lines here and there. I think I've hit the dry paper up there. Before that burnt sienna dries, I run some sepia along the bottom of the foot to make it darker. And I can paint in that claw that's there as well with the sepia. So that's on dry paper there, the claw. And this other one needs a claw on it as well. And on this toe remaining, I paint a few little burnt sienna lines on the dry paper. Now I'll paint in this leg here. This is water. I've wet the top section, but where my brush is now, I'm wetting behind the pencil line, so to the right of the pencil line. This is burnt sienna now. As I paint it on, I'm mindful of leaving some of the lighter underwash showing. I don't want to completely cover it with this colour, which is why I wet the paper first. I might put a bit of colour on the front of the leg there as well. It's still wet, so I can come back with some sepia to darken this top section. Just taking the paint out of my brush, smooth that paint out a bit more. I wet the back toe with water. Burnt sienna again here. I run it along my pencil line, it bleeds back up over the toe. It leaves the top edge lighter. I've wet this front toe with water and I've got burnt sienna here as well. I do the same thing. And now I take a bit up to the top line. Before that burnt sienna dries, I get a bit of sepia on my brush. There's a little dark section there I can see on the reference photo. Now some sepia on the claw, and I'll run it along the top of the toe a little way and along the bottom. It's still wet, so the paint's bleeding. A few little lines across that light section. claw here on this back toe with sepia on dry paper. And there's another claw in the middle that I can see. My middle toe looks a bit pale there, so I've just washed a bit of burnt sienna over the top of it. Just here I've got a watercolour bloom. It's sort of created the edge of a feather, so I'm going to leave that. But I've drawn a few more feather shapes in just here. I will have drawn these on the line drawing for you, so you won't have to draw them in. Okay, I've got my number 2 brush and some of the grey paint. This is the mix of French ultramarine and burnt sienna. It's not too dark, it's similar to the colour that I used to wash in this area. I'm painting on dry paper here, just around those feather shapes that I've made. Around the edge of the feather, on the feather below. I can pull a few lines into the feather above to create those little separations. And before that dries, I soften away that paint edge there with my damp brush. Now I'll go up here to the legs, still using the grey on dry paper, painting around the feather shapes I created. And then if I feel I need to, I use my damp brush to soften away paint edges. Painting that up into the feather to create the separation there, and then I soften the paint edge below. I'll paint a bit of colour up here under the wing. Take the paint out of my brush, soften away that edge there. Here I've switched to my little 0 brush. Just drag some of that grey up onto the feather itself. And then I spread that paint out. Here I'm coming back with a bit more colour, still using the grey. Softening that paint edge there. And then I decided to put a little bit of colour at the bottom there to create another feather. Switch down to my 0 brush here. Then I decided to come back and have a little play with the ground. So I've just wet that area underneath that foot on the left, and I've got a bit of sepia here. Now I've got my 0 brush and a bit more sepia. I felt that I needed more of a shadow underneath the feet, so that's why I've done that. I'll do the same thing here. I wet underneath the feet with water. And then some more sepia. I come back in a little while and I do a bit more work here on the ground as well. I stood back and looked at my painting and felt that it needed a bit more sepia there. So that's given me a shadow under those feet. Then I came back with my small eradicator brush and I started to soften a few of the hard edges on the wings. I wet the brush with water and I used it on the dry paper. I'm rubbing gently, randomly here and there, just to take away a few of those hard edges. Sometimes too many hard edges are difficult to look at. I thought that this would make all the feathers look a bit softer looking. I stood back and looked at my painting and decided I needed a bit more work on the ground area. So this time I'm using a bigger brush. This is my number 7. I wet it and dry it, and then I pick up the paint. This is sepia. I dab off some of the excess and I use the side of the brush to rub over the paper. That's better. I just flipped the brush over. The paint was on one side of it. Get a bit more paint, keep rubbing. And then I got impatient with that and felt that I wasn't doing enough with it, so I ended up wetting my brush. And I picked up a bit more sepia. Okay, so I've got the texture there from the dry brushing, and now I've got a wet brush and some more sepia. So you'll see the texture through what I'm doing. It's only very pale. I just picked up a bit more paint then. I still like the look of that dry brushing, but I just wanted a bit more colour. Spreading it out now, using the side of my brush still. It's mainly tinted water there. And then after I did that, I was happy with it. So there's only a tiny amount of colour on the brush. It's, like I said, mainly tinted water. I dried it off and removed my washi tape. And then I was quite happy with it. Thanks everybody. I hope you enjoyed painting the seagulls with me. I can't wait to see yours.